If you look at the places that my family selects for our vacations, Eilat in July, Scottsdale in August, Orlando in July, the face of the sun next summer, I can tell you that we are not afraid of hot weather. As a matter of fact, having grown up in Chicago, Blair and I agree in a basic fundamental understanding of vacations, hot is good and cold is bad. And that's the way we've lived our lives. And so when we imagine these summer months, I can tell you that for us, when we show up at these tropical locations, when we show up to Eilat and it's 125 degrees outside, we're excited to go on boats and to enjoy ourselves. And the residents who live there are just looking to survive the heat. There is a certain frustration in people's mentalities when it becomes this hot outside and they're not raised in Chicago. We often forget about the context in which the Torah is set, the context in which our people's stories unfold. But those contexts include really hot locations. And the summer months of these Torah readings reflect a certain frustration in the repeated stories of our people that mirror for us the experiences in which most of the Jewish biblical narrative occurred. The run is Shlach Lecha and the failure of the spies, Korach and the people's rebellion, the death of Moses' brother and sister in Chukat, Balak, this week in a foreign prophet being hired as a mercenary to come and curse our people. Our people, week after week after week, read stories during the summer months that should be extremely worrisome to us, and that ask so many questions about who we are, who our enemies are, and what our challenges are as a people that we have to overcome. And I have to believe that these stories happen during the summer. In the waning chapters of Bamidbar, the narrative aspect of the Torah, as we approach Moses' final chapter of life, I have to believe that they're placed here for a reason. And as I began to reflect on Bilam, this foreign prophet who has insight and divinity in the sense that he receives prophecy from God, not a foreign God, but the Torah makes it very clear from God, I looked to the wisdom of our ancestors, to the Talmud, and as always, I am not disappointed. There is a story in Masachet Sanhedrin, in the section that's about our courts and our judicial system in Sanhedrin, on page 106, that I read this week for the first time. And it states that Bilam turned to Yitro, the Canaanite. The verse that it's playing off of is, and he looked at the Canaanite and he took up his parable from this week's Torah portion. Bilam turned to Yitro, the Canaanite, meaning they're saying that's who this is Yitro, and asked him accusingly, "Were you not in Egypt with us, a member of the same council? Who placed you alongside the mighty of the world?" And I stopped and thought to myself, Bilam and Yitro were buddies from Egypt? From where do we know this? And the Talmud goes on to explain that Pharaoh maintained a council, a cabinet, of three extraordinarily wise, blessed people who had connections to the divine. And he went to them, and he proposed the law that all Jewish children be thrown in the Nile. And that cabinet of these three extraordinarily wise, non-Jewish people who served Pharaoh and who had access to divine messaging, according to Masechet Sanhedrin, was Bilam, Yitro, and Yoav. In English, Bilam, the prophet from this week's Torah portion, Yitro, Moses' father-in-law, Kohen Gadol of Midian, the high priest of Midian, and Job, the subject of perhaps the most perplexing book in the entire Hebrew Bible. And you should know that that's not the only time that these three people are grouped together, because I just explained to you that the Talmud asks in Masechet Bava Batra in a different section about authorship of the books, who wrote these sections. It explains that Moses is the author of the Torah, of the section about Bilam, and the book of Job. Underlying question is, how does Moses have access to what was said between Bilam and Balak, between a foreign prophet and a foreign king? There were no Jews in the room to report back to us. How do we possibly have a record of that story? How do we have a record of the book of Job? What is that book trying to teach us? Is a question that academics and rabbis have been asking for generations. So here the Talmud comes along and explains that this great council, the OG, the original three wise men, sat together. Bilam, Yitro, and Yoav. Bilam, Jethro, and Job. And they heard Pharaoh's idea to murder all of the Jewish children. And then it was changed to murder all of the Jewish sons. And Bilam affirmed it as a fantastic idea. Job was silent in the face of the suggestion, and Jethro ran away from Egypt in fear that his vote no longer mattered. He ran away to Midian. And in each of their introductions, we see Yitro's introduced as Kohen Midian, the high priest of Midian. It gives him a certain access to God, a certain authority. Bilam, ki yadati et asher tivarech, mivorach ve'asher ta'or you are, right? Those people acknowledge him as those who Bilam blesses will be blessed, those whom he curses will be cursed. Job is introduced to us, v'haya ishahu, and this man, he was tam v'yashar v'yar Adonai. He was simple and lived on the straight and narrow and lived with a fear and an awe of God. All three of them are introduced with great reverence for their sense of connection with the divine will. Yitro is Moses' father-in-law and imparts in him the wisdom of how to manage the Jewish people, how to lead the Jewish people. Bilam becomes the adversary, the foreign prophet whom we face in the desert. And Job is condemned for his silence to a life of eternal, silent suffering, according to the rabbis. And in this tractate of Talmud, there is a recognition that the different evils that we see permeate the Hebrew Bible all seem to be connected to a singular source. What was unleashed on the Jewish people in Egypt seems to face us again and again and again. If it's not Pharaoh, it's Pharaoh's advisors. And if it's not Pharaoh's advisors, it's the children of Pharaoh's advisors. And if at the end of Bilam's story we survive Bilam, even though Bilam meets his demise, one of the last sentences is Bilam's admiration for another group called Amalek. And it is impossible for me to read these stories this week and not think to myself about Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis, who nobody in this room had ever heard of before this year, and groups in Africa, and think about the Iranian tentacles that have spread throughout the world, and think about how even the sages of the Talmud understood that the problems that the Jewish people face, although they may appear varied, they have to be related in some way. There are two theologies that we inhabit during the summer. There's two different perspectives on God. And this frustrating one of these weeks is the one that the problems and the evils of the world belong to other, and we have to defeat them. Bilam has to meet his demise. Yitro has to be rewarded. Job has to be punished. And those have to be meted out by the Holy One. The turning point, the reflection point of our Jewish summer each and every year is actually a day of fasting and reflection that I think is highly misunderstood. And we call that day Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av. What happens in a world where all of our enemies conspire against us and they prove victorious over us? That day is the 9th of Av. And if you have never commemorated the 9th of Av as part of this community, I'd invite you to join us either in the evening or in the morning or a special mincha service. It is a very different day in the Jewish calendar. A day of fasting and mourning and reflection and reading of the book of Lamentations. Reading of a book of what the repercussions look like for the Jewish people if we don't listen. But actually, I think too many of us understand Tisha B'Av as just the destruction of Jerusalem and our sacred places and our people. Tisha B'Av is the pivot from the summer of frustration to a fall of promise. Because the new theology that replaces these summer parshiot is that our future is not held in the hands of Bilam or Yoav or Yitro. Our future is held in our own hands, and it is in fact our responsibility not to read the book of Lamentations and cry, not to receive the spies in Shlach Lecha and cry, not to hear the words of Bilam and cry, but to look inside of ourselves and to do tshuva and to ask, what can we do as a people to change the course of our future and, in fact, the future of the entire world? That process begins, I believe, as soon as we end the book of Lamentations. It begins in that moment and it continues through the Nila service to the close of Yom Kippur. we recognize that if we see this world as simply others who are coming to get us, then it will invariably end in a Tisha B'Av ceremony sitting on the floor crying in candlelight. But if we look inside our own souls as a Jewish people and we ask ourselves, what can we do? Or even in a more individual sense, what can I do? What can I do to strengthen the Jewish identity of my life, my family, my community? How might I contribute better? How might I help Jewish people not only here but everywhere? How is it not somebody else's responsibility but my own? Once we have that shift and we start answering it by looking in the mirror, we're no longer in the frustrating summer months of these parshiot. We have transitioned into a process called cheshbon hanefesh, the accounting of our soul. And that accounting of my soul is not only for my sake, it's for my family's sake, it's for my community's sake, and it's for our people's sake. Tisha B'Av to Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur is not a process that we often reflect on because they seem to us to be two different, disparate ideas, separated by months, by seasons, and by climate. But in fact, just like the seasons change, we as Jews are also supposed to change. We're supposed to understand that as we approach fall and the leaves begin to fall off of the trees, as an aside to the LA community, there are places where leaves fall off the trees in the fall. When we start to see leaves fall off the trees, and we start to see a natural kind of progression occur, a dying before the winter sets on, we have to remind ourselves that the answers and the strength that we're looking for, it's no longer out there in the summer travels. It's inside of our own home. It's inside of our own community. It's inside of our own hearts and souls. Don't be scared of the fall and the winter. Don't misconstrue the frustration of the summer to be permanent. Learn from it. Turn the air conditioning on. Go out and meet people. Offer them help. Help yourselves. These parshiot are some of my favorite parshiot because it's difficult to learn lessons from history about the times that were best for the Jewish people. We learn our lessons from our lowest points in life. We all can look back on our lives and say, my best decisions were made following some of the worst experiences that I had to undergo. That relationship is not a coincidence. We learn and we grow and we learn and we grow through these hot, frustrating experiences when our blood is about to boil over. And then we're supposed to take a moment, calm down, perhaps sit on the floor and recognize it's not going to get any lower than this, and understand that the Savior that we've been looking for, it's always existed It's been there right in front of our faces. It's the people whom we love. It's the communities that we count on. It's our families. And we're always going to find the answers in the places that we call home. We journey throughout the summers looking for answers, looking for experiences, looking for stories to tell our friends and to tell our loved ones over and over again throughout our lives. And those stories are fantastic, and those journeys are fantastic. And the pictures that live on and on are inspiring. But when we look for meaning and purpose, when we want to understand what our lives are about, it's about coming back to this place. It's not about Pharaoh's tribunal anymore. It's about the tribunal in each one of our lives who help us make our decisions. It's about having the courage of Yitro to say, I can't watch this decision be made. I have to run out and embark on a future. And in that singular decision to separate himself away from evil, he propelled himself to saving the most important Jewish child that was ever set in the water. In a decision to stand against Pharaoh, he didn't realize it, but he decided to save the Jewish people, to help save the Savior that we were searching for. The answer all along was put in a basket for us to discover and rediscover again and again. That basket, we refer to it as an ark. We put all of our answers in the ark, but sometimes we forget to come back and visit, open it up, and read the secrets of our people that lay waiting for us all along. Shabbat Shalom.